Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are based in. Welcome to this ISDP webinar on China and China's Himalayan hustle. I must mention at the outset that this is a part of the Indo-Pacific Center's project in ISDP on China's Himalayan hustle. And this webinar is a third webinar in series. We held 2 rounds of webinars earlier covering about China's infrastructural planning in the Himalayan regions. And the second webinar was about China's economic dominance in the region. Now, this is the third webinar, which deals more about how the Chinese are trying to change the status quo in the Himalayan regions. Now, in order to discuss that, we have a wonderful panel today. And let me introduce briefly to all of our participants here. We have first with us Dr. Franco Denal. He is a senior research advisor in the Asia-Pacific Leadership Network. He is also a non-resident fellow in the Stockholm Center's South Asia program and also an adjunct fellow at the East-West Center. He keeps writing about India, China, India, Pakistan, and critical issues covering South Asian regions. He has written enormously about the boundary dispute, about the China's approach to the Himalayan regions. And I will encourage our participants to go through his writings. Some of his writings are easily available in the Stockholm Center. Then we have Professor Vincent Wang. He's a sinologist. He is currently the Dean of the College of Arts and Science and a Professor of Political Science at Adelphi University in New York. He is also a Senior Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. He has been a faculty member at the University of Richmond and also taught in different other universities covering China, Asia, and the geopolitical issues of the regions. Then we have Dr. Asta Chadha. She's an associate professor at the International Relations Department at the Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto, in Japan. She's also affiliated with a number of strategic think tanks forums. She's a member of International Studies Association and also very closely follows India-Japan relations, South Asian security issues, and also the Indo-Pacific security and strategic issues at large. Then we have Dr. Srini Sitaraman, who is very familiar to you because he keeps on writing on some of these issues. He's a professor at Daniel K. Inyo Center for Asia-Pacific Studies, which is popularly known as DKI-APCCS, which is based in Honolulu in Hawaii. Professor Srini Sitaraman is also focusing a lot of other issues apart from India-China relations. He covers regional conflict, the South Asian issues. He has also written about other issues covering the entire Indo-Pacific regions. He has also, very closely directed the program in the United Nations, which has been an award-winning model program. So I would request all of our participants here also to follow his writings in APCCS website. We have, last not the least, we have a young, promising, and a bright scholar from India, that is Mr. Rahul Karan Reddy. He is a senior research associate at the Organization for Research on China and Asia. Rahul interestingly covers, he's one of those very few Indian scholars who covers China's domestic politics and Chinese economy and trade politics. He has produced a good amount of data-driven research at the ORCA website. I would encourage our participants and readers to, visit the ORCA website and try to follow his writings and his modules that he has prepared on Chinese domestic politics and also on China's trade diplomacy in the regions. Interestingly, recently he actually published a special issue on trans-boundary water security in South Asia, which has been heavily downloaded from the ORCA website. So welcome all of you, my fellow panelists, and it's a great pleasure to have you. A little bit about myself. Myself, Jagannath Panda. I heads the Indo-Pacific Center at the Institute for Security and Development Policy. ISDP is a Swedish think tank. We have two directors, Dr. Nicholas Swanstrom, who is also a participant here and listening to our conversation. And also, we have a Washington, D.C. office affiliated with American Foreign Policy Council. We are a dynamic institute covering Korea, Indo-Pacific issue, China, and also Taiwan very closely. I would encourage all of our participants to surf ISDP website to not only to know about this seminar in details about this particular project, but also about our other publications and projects in details. Without really taking much time, let me start today's interactions. So again, welcome all of you. And I think it's a pleasure to have you for this third round of our China's Himalayan Hustle webinar. Just to start, I think in the first two webinars, we covered in more details about how China is trying to plan its economic projects in the Himalayan regions, covering the Tibetan regions, and also how China is actually trying to dominate the regions in terms of carrying out different developmental projects in the Himalayan regions, particularly trying to strengthen the relationship with the India's neighbors, which are the South Asian neighbors for both China and India. So in that context, we had a very productive first two webinars where we invited a range of European experts, Asian experts, and also American experts to share their views. Now, in this webinar, we are also going a little further to discuss about how the Chinese are actually trying to change the status quo in the Himalayan regions, which is a concern not only for India, but also the world at large, because Himalaya is widely considered not only in India, but also across the world. It's considered as a global common. It is of interest to many countries, but the Chinese, without really taking into consideration India's consent, India's considerations, or the consideration of the other South Asian countries, the Chinese are trying to change the status quo there. Now, there are a number of issues we need to discuss. One is the way that they are carrying out the military modernization program in the military developmental programs in the Tibetan Plateau, which has adequate implications, substantial implications for the Himalayan regions. Second is the kind of range of connectivity issues and the economic coercion strategy they are implementing. Third, the way they are trying to grab land, not only from India, but also from other South Asian neighbors like, let's say, Bhutan. Also, probably going forward, maybe, we don't know, maybe Nepal and Pakistan, which is supposedly one of the biggest alliance of China in the regions, could be subject to this kind of land grab of Chinese strategy. And fourth, which is also problematic, is the way they are carrying out their diplomatic ties and building mini-scale alliance kind of a partnerships in the Himalayan regions, trying to change the status quo. So therefore, in order to understand all of these, I would invite each one of you to share your views. How do you really explain the China strategy? Of course, this strategy is not entirely probably Xi Jinping centric, even though during Xi Jinping, we have seen the Chinese are trying to change a lot through new policy measures. They have become a very aggressive neighbor for India. But I think all of this started before Xi Jinping came to power. So in order to trigger our discussion, I would first invite Frank to you. You have written on the subject about this in the Stimson's website, about these in the South Asian Voices, and also in other forums. How do you really explain China's strategy in terms of changing the status quo in the regions? How do you really see the strategy in the context of the current leadership and in the future leadership? And what India and the Western countries should do together in order to change the China's revisionist strategy that they are trying to implement and change the status quo? Over to you, Frank.
Thank you, Jagannath, and thank you to the ISDP team for inviting me. Pleasure to be part of this esteemed panel. So I'll focus on kind of two main points, as Jagannath said, one on the military posturing we're seeing from China in and around the Himalayas, and then more broadly on the geoeconomic front. And so on military posturing, we're now past the 4-year mark since the 2020 Ladakh incursions. which do remain a significant turning point for the Sino-Indian strategic relationship and window into Xi Jinping's thinking about India. And so India is fortunate to still occupy key overlook heights in and around the newly occupied areas in Ladakh. It's still clear that China isn't going anywhere. It's continually upgrading its force presence and facilities in the area. One assessment in April held that 70% of China's 57 India-facing Western Theater Command air bases and heliports are either new or being upgraded. And China's most advanced stealth fighters, the J-20 aircraft, have been spotted at the Shigatse Peace Airport in Tibet. Building on that, a big focus of recent PLA Air Force development facing India has been heliports. And this reflects the geographic difficulty of building long enough runways for transport and other aircraft to take off from, given the mountainous terrain and that the high altitude imposes extended runways for takeoff due to the thin air. Helicopters don't face that runway challenge. It also, again, signifies the intention of the PLA to stay put. Helicopters allow rapid reinforcement and resupply of PLA ground forces closest to India. These PLA forces are well entrenched with hardened bunkers and artillery, but they often sit in different valleys and pockets and can be fairly disconnected from each other. The helicopters help link this. And on top of this, there is a persistent and expanding sophisticated Chinese drone fleet to detect vulnerabilities in the Indian position, which could be exploited, identify similar vulnerabilities in Chinese deployments to be shored up, and also, if need be, conduct strikes. So the real concern is that China is building upon what it has, while continually seeking for fleeting windows of opportunity to push forward and gain a strategic height or additional territory. And we saw this with the effort to take Yangtze Ridge near Tawang in Arunachal Pradesh in December 2022. After this failed, China is now deploying combined arms brigades near that specific area. Along the LAC, Ladakh and the western sector has, of course, seen the most heated clashes, but the areas around Arunachal Pradesh and the eastern sector could see a similar intensification of China-India skirmishes. And the central sector remains relatively quiet, but that could change. All of this stretches the Indian military, which I'll come back to probably later in this conversation. And I think in geoeconomics, China has been able to penetrate much of the region. We saw a couple of weeks ago, for example, the degree of Pakistan's fiscal dependence on China, when Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif had to write a formal letter to the Chinese government asking for debt reprofiling. China's invested heavily in new roads, hydropower projects, fiber optic networks in Bhutan, while at the same time is quietly creating facts on the ground, as Jagannath alluded to, and building its military presence in the north-central areas of Bhutan and around the Doklam Plateau, critical to Indian security. China is Nepal's biggest source of FDI and is engaged in similar infrastructure projects there. I'm only focusing on Himalayan countries. I haven't touched Sri Lanka or the Maldives, but there is this intensifying Chinese challenge to Indian interests, which is backed by this patient Chinese dedication of resources to a long-term strategy. I'll park my comments as to what the US and India can do about it until later in the discussion. I'm interested to hear from the other panelists about their own surveys. Thank you.
Excellent, Frank. We'll come back to you about US and India collaborations, what can be done in the next round. Professor Wang, over to you.
Yes, I'd like to make a few comments on how China is changing the status quo in the Himalayas and why. First of all, I'd like to thank Jagannath, you and the ISDP for inviting me to this very important webinar, and I'm very honored to serve on this esteemed panel. I think that on the issue about how China is changing the status quo, here I might draw a analogy, sort of a maritime analogy, which is how China had changed the status quo on the South China Sea. Now, South China Sea obviously is full of water, not full of mountains, but Chinese tactics are nonetheless very similar. I think it can draw some inspiration. So the way the Chinese did was that they gradually changed the facts on the ground with unilateral action. Each action is too small to make a big deal, or to involve more actors and so on. But gradually, they change the fact on the ground, and this is actually especially after the Chinese leader Xi Jinping in 2015 committed to not militarize the South China Sea. Now, several years later, now you can see that South China Sea is very militarized, and China was the main actor in producing this. A lot of former features were turned into artificial islands with airfields, reinforcement of military vessels, and denial of other countries. In fact, many claimants. There are 6 claimants in the South China Sea, and the U.S. is not a claimant, but the U.S. Main interest is freedom of navigation in this area. So I think this is actually a very important similarity, which is that China was the one that resorted to a series of unilateral action to change the facts on the ground. And the second, of course, I already mentioned a little bit, is that China's promise was empty. This is after China had already committed to not militarize the region. And of course, at the same time, sort of like a split screen movie, China was engaging with all these Southeast Asian countries in a conversation known as the Code of Conduct, which had been going on for 20 years. It's not going anywhere. So this reminds me of the on and off and never conclusive talks between India and China on the border dispute, started soon after 1962. So I think the Chinese behavior can be described as a duplicity campaign, and that it's very similar to the China-India border dispute. And the final similarity between the South China Sea issue and the Himalaya issue is that in the South China Sea case, China is much larger and much more powerful than any Southeast Asian country. And China also cares a lot more about this because it defines it as a sort of a territorial integrity. In fact, starting from 2010, the Chinese leaders have defined South China Sea as quote unquote core interest. So in other words, non-negotiable. But then, at the same time, China would roll out these red carpet saying to these Southeast Asian countries, and now, of course, more recently, it's the Belt and Road Initiative. Basically, China was trying to decouple the sort of this military aggression from its rollout of economic incentive. So I see a similarity there with what China is doing in the Himalayas. So on the one hand, it's China dwarfs over Nepal, Bhutan, and other countries, and even Pakistan. But then on the other hand, China, the only real contender in this region is India. But China really wants to decouple this. So there is a difference between size, power, and salience between the contestants in these two regions as well. Now, why China does this? I think there are also 3 very simple reasons. One, I think, is really just the need for a rising power with global ambition, not just regional ambition, global ambition, to expand its strategic space. China used to be oriented toward the East Asia. It was a maritime power, but is long very concerned about the Strait of Malacca dilemma. Sort of the sea lanes were controlled by the United States and so on. So, and then in recent years, especially after 1959, that China has fortified its infrastructure development in Tibet and so on. So Tibet has been used as a wedge to expand into South Asia. So this is a rising power that wants to connect 2 strategic realms, East Asia and South Asia. And in South Asia, as I said earlier, most countries are weak. and the only real contender is India. So you see all these hustles in the Himalayas. And second reason already mentioned, the size and salience comparison. And third, I will argue that in the case of India, there is a contest between a rising China and rising India. There are two rises. Most people talk about the rise of China, but I also pay attention to the rise of India. But for Chinese strategic thinkers, in order for China to establish strategic eminence, it must supplant, suppress, or displace India. So I think these three reasons can explain China's behavior in the Himalayas.
Excellent points, Professor Wang. And I think your point about rising China versus rising India, and also your point about drawing that similarity between the course and strategy in the South China Sea and in the Himalayan belt is also very interesting. We'll come back to discuss further those points. But let me now move to Asta. You have covered the region more from India-Japan point of view. Maybe you could highlight what do you think about the China's revisionist strategy in the Himalayan regions, and what India and Japan could possibly do going forward? Over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Jagan. I must begin by thanking you first for this opportunity. Thanks to ISDP as well, and to my fellow panelists for having me here together with them. I'll try and pick it up exactly where Professor Vincent left it, wherein India does want to rise together with China because it sees enough space for two powers to rise. But Chinese perception is different. One, it doesn't see a space for two powers rising at the same time. And two, it doesn't really see India as an equal contender either. So it does see India in some way less capable, right? Which is why this Himalayan hustle, because there is an understanding in China that they could actually, by partnering with other nations that are India's neighbors, they could actually push India into a certain corner in that sense, so that India really does not rise and start becoming a challenger to China. Now, what we need to understand about Himalayas is that, one, it's a very complex issue, as my fellow panelists already highlighted. It's ongoing. It's unlikely to be resolved very soon, right? So we need to look at Chinese behavior in general and how not just the Himalayan nations, but also, like Professor Vincent earlier mentioned, how other countries are looking at Chinese behavior, right? So there are several trends that emerge when you look at Chinese behavior. So on one hand, China does want to maintain its peace, tranquility, as it says diplomatically, and wants to highlight its sovereignty within the region, especially along the LAC. But then there is this repeated issue, specifically when it comes to other countries developing any sort of infrastructure along that line. And so China, on one hand, expects other nations to accept Chinese infrastructural developments because it's happening on Chinese territory. But when it happens on the other side of the border, there is sometimes a violent opposition to it, right? And the nature of these constructions could be anything from a bridge, road, dam to a dual purpose village, let's say. Second issue is that there is a specific nature of these activities. So on one hand, China wants to pose as Chinese actions being a result of provocation by other neighbors. But there is this slight hint of everything being either premeditated or planned when it comes to how and why China chooses to attack, or how and when China chooses to behave a certain way with a neighbor. Third, there is an outcome. Anytime that there is a friction at the LAC or across the Himalayas, there is an outcome, which is loss of land. But to understand that more specifically, because the perceptions of LAC are very different on the Indian side and very different on the Chinese side, it's easier to understand it in terms of loss of buffer zones. And so clearly, as a result of these skirmishes, Indian territory, let's say, has become the buffer zone, rather than India and China sharing a buffer zone, right? So that is really a difficult issue, because the way China wants to de-escalate is through equidistant disengagement, but that really is not a very good option when you look at it from the Indian perspective. Fourth, China is challenging the status quo, not only in terms of security, but if you look at Chinese constructions, for that matter, any construction that has suddenly started happening with this contest across the LAC, it has implications for security, it has implications for economic livelihood of communities, and it has implications for environmental damage that is happening as a result of these constructions. Fifth, there are certain trends, and I'll try and touch upon what Professor Vincent earlier mentioned when he was juxtaposing South China Sea issue with the Himalayan issue. And I too notice certain trends, and that's how it's easy to understand Chinese behavior, which is not always very different when we look at it from a Himalayan region point of view. It's more of a common factor in how China behaves in that region. So there is militarization, there are surprise attacks, there is sometimes violence leading to death, and or violence leading to injuries. We saw with the case of Philippines, right, very recently. There is a claim on territories which is based on historical records or what China perceives as its territory because of whatever ethnic or historical reasons. And there is this need in China to keep the conflict alive, because that continues to, in a way, fuel what China wants to do, which is, continue to have like an active border so that it can consistently contest the borders. And then there is, as a result, a renaming of territories, which China has done, whether it is with the Senkaku Island dispute or it's along the LAC. China has done that. And lastly, as I mentioned, there is an establishment of dual purpose villages, which is mainly should be looked at as a surveillance mechanism, right? So there we need to lastly look at some possible lessons. And these are lessons which I would like to highlight Japan has learned equally with its own Senkaku Island dispute with China. So I'm going to put India and Japan there together and try and see what both of them have learned in their individual cases and how that learning can actually help them collaborate more. And as for collaboration and the details, we can go on to the next round, but I'll just like to highlight some possible learnings that both the countries have had. So Chinese actions in both the nations have been interpreted as being both aggressive and assertive, right? They have been perceived as being premeditated and planned and not really a result of provocation. Three, both the nations understand that there needs to be better infrastructure. So when it comes to Japan, for instance, it is developing those infrastructures, not just in its own island disputes, but also helping India develop its northeast region, right? There is a collaboration and a need for collaboration amongst Himalayan partners. So it's not just an India-China issue. There are other sovereign nations along the border as well. So there has to be that understanding and collaboration. And lastly, but not the least, there has to be a certain amount of military preparedness. So we see India partnering in Yuddhabhyas exercise with the USA in Himalayan region in 2022. Then 2023, they moved it to the Alaskan mountains to kind of mimic Himalayan temperatures and terrain. Similarly, India also did the Vajraprahar in 2023, which was again in Himalayas. And lastly, there is this understanding specifically with regard to Himalayas that India needs to make its forces aware of the Himalayan cultures. So for instance, recently India started teaching Tibetology to its defense forces in order to help them understand what they're dealing with, really. So what it comes down to in terms of learning, if I were to condense it, is partnerships, which India and Japan realize that they need, partnerships, preparedness, and proactiveness. I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you. We will come back on that issue, partnership between India and Japan. In fact, in last two webinars, we discussed a lot about India and EU partnerships, particularly through infrastructural development, through global gateway initiatives and all. So it would be more interesting if you could cover some of these areas of what India and Japan could further do, not only in the Himalayan regions, but also covering the Bay of Bengal regions and other northeastern parts of India. We'll come back to you during the second and third round, Asta. Thank you. So over to you, Srini.
Fantastic. Jagannath, thank you for inviting me, and it's wonderful to hear this very incisive and precise comments. And thank you to all my panelists. So before I begin, I have to say this as an official disclaimer. I do not speak on behalf of the Department of Defense or the US government or any of its agencies. I'm here exclusively as an individual citizen and as a person who studies this part of the world. So that's the official part here. Now, let me step back a little bit from the front lines of what Frank and Asta and Vincent and Jagannath, you yourself have identified, and look at the geostrategic picture. That's what we do from where I sit in the Indo-Pacific. As you know, the Indo-Pacific Command is the one that looks at the whole of Asia. From former U.S. Indo-Pacific commander is fond of saying they look from Hollywood to Bollywood, from polar bears to penguins. That was his quote, and that is kind of stuck. The map, if you look at the region, is vast. And if you look at the flashpoints in the area, if you look at the flashpoints and the strategic priorities, there are multiple, many just concerning China, not talking about Russia, Ukraine, or the emerging security situation in the Middle East, which obviously has a bearing on what we are talking about today, directly in many ways. The first one is that the Taiwan Straits is a big issue. From where I said, that is something that we grapple with almost on a daily basis. And that is an issue that our interlocutors and our visitors and the people that we dialogue with bring up every session. There is a sense of urgency there, which sort of waxes and wanes in a bit. On when I talk of waxes or wanes, I'm talking in days. On Monday, there's a sense of urgency. On Wednesday, everything looks great. On Friday, there's urgent tension. So that's there. The second one is the Korean Peninsula. The Korean Peninsula is deeply embedded in the broader Northeast region, not just because of North Korea, but also whatever happens in the Straits of Taiwan will have reverberations for the Korean Peninsula as well as for Japan, right? Just independent of the Diaoyu Senkaku Island issue, which many of our speakers have already brought up. So China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, there's that broad spectrum that you're looking at. And if you step a little further south, then you have the South China issue. Obviously, the key, I should say, the antagonist now for PRC is the Philippines. And the relationship between Philippines and China, much like India and China, can flip depending on who is in power in the Philippines. When Duterte was in power, it all seemed like Philippines was going one way. Now we seem to be going another way. And that kind of goes back and forth quite a bit. And currently, the situation is very tense. And the other players in South China Sea, particularly Vietnam, is a major player. But ASEAN as a player is sort of trying to downplay some of the urgency or some of the force with which other partners see the situation. And then you come down, there's another area that is easily forgotten in the broader spectrum is the Indo-Pacific, is the Pacific Islands. And where I sit, we look at the Pacific Islands very closely. And there's a lot happening with Solomon Islands, with Fiji, with Papua New Guinea, even small countries like Republic of Marshall Islands in Vanuatu. There's a lot of movement, which you probably covered potentially in your first two sets of webinars. There is a huge infrastructure and economic and diplomatic and even to a certain security play, not a military play necessarily, but definitely a security play, where fishing is a huge issue for the nations in there. And they recognize the importance of China, the partnership that comes, the value that comes with it, but also the dangers associated with it. And they're also doing what they're doing in South Asia. They're picking off one island or one partner at a time, right? So, and the lastly, and most importantly, probably, is South Asia, which others have covered the various dynamics along the border. But interestingly, let me highlight, instead of foot stomping what others have already pointed out, let me highlight in the last, say, 1 month or less than a month, there's been a slight thaw in the political relations between India and China, right? In the sense they're opening up a small window for dialogue, which has not been present before in the previous 4 years. I'm not talking about the core commander level talks. I'm talking about the talks at the level of external affairs ministry. And there's a small window. And I think India has chanced upon that window because it realizes the asymmetric balance, which Frank has identified right at the beginning. The military balance overwhelmingly tilts in favor of China. And it may not be wise on the part of India to engage in a military contest unless otherwise it is absolutely necessary to do so in that particular region. So I think there's an opportunity there, and the opportunity is particularly going to not last forever, but there's so many changes happening in the region. I particularly want to highlight there's an intense civil war in Myanmar. We see a lot of reports on the how the balance is structuring, and the Chinese have a problem on the border. And the Myanmar problem has an impact on India and its northeast, as well as in Bangladesh, which is seeing, a revolt, a replacement, and a revolutionary change in many ways. And you saw that a year back, a similar one in Pakistan. You saw that about a year back, or year and a half back in Sri Lanka. And you almost saw another flip, even though it was democratic flip in Maldives. So in all the countries in India's near neighborhood, the role of the People's Republic of China has been felt in one way or another, either in the change of the governments that were being propelled, either to the economic situation, to political situation, or to the internal dynamics of these countries in that particular area. So, including Afghanistan, which is also sitting on a treasure trove of minerals, which many countries, particularly China, is uniquely placed to extract from that particular region. So given these broad geopolitical picture that I have painted here, I think we have to place what is happening between India and China along the border, even though it precedes many of the issues that we talked about earlier in this particular session. We have to place that in and see if there are ways to see if we can march back some of the salami slicing tactics, changing facts on the ground, or the way that they eat the cookie one bit at a time. By the time they finish eating the cookie, nobody really notices. The gray zone stuff that they're doing in South China Sea, in the Pacific Islands, is particularly highlighted, and effective challenges are mounted, which not only include military, but also diplomatic, economic, and infrastructural. So I will leave it at that and look forward to the sustaining discussion. Thank you. Mahalo.
Thank you, Srini. I think those are interesting point. Again, I think looking at the big picture of geostrategic, perspectives, particularly covering Taiwan Strait to Korean Peninsula to Pacific Island regions, how smaller countries, medium rank or smaller economies in the region should be mindful about China's gray zone tactics, salami slicing tactics, and also the economic coercion tactics that China is trying to implement from time to time. With this note, let me go to invite Rahul, who has actually done some interesting studies collecting data from the regions, and he has put out in Orca's website covering some of these issues. So Rahul, I would invite you to cover some of these questions which is mentioned in the website, in the concept note, and also covering some of your research that you have been covering about China, Pakistan, and China and the South Asian neighbors. Over to you, Rahul.
Thank you, Dr. Panda. Thank you for having me here, and it's great to be able to engage on a subject of great importance for South Asia. So my co-panelists of this webinar have made some excellent opening remarks, and I will try and provide an overview of China's destabilizing actions in the Himalayan region. Before I begin, I'd just like to say that the project that Dr. Panda and ISDP are doing will add immense value to the study of China and South Asia. So the remarks I make today will take off from some of the work that me and my colleagues at Orca have done over the past year. and especially the special issue on Tibet and the Dalai Lama's succession that Orca worked with ISDP on, a special issue on soft power in South Asia that my colleagues Omkar Pole and Ratish Mehta have worked on, and a special issue on transboundary water security that I've edited. I'll also leverage some of my fieldwork in Nepal on public opinion of India and China as well. I'll just begin by discussing three overarching ways in which China has, over the course of the last decade or so, with particular reference to Pakistan, Nepal, and Bhutan, altered the status quo and sort of undermined the regional order. The first is trade and commercial interactions that China is engaged in. And it isn't just about trade deficits that are being formed between China and Himalayan countries, it's the nature of trade dependencies and the asymmetry of products traded that tells us exactly how China is cultivating these dependencies. Take the case of Nepal, where China's trade relationship is highly biased in favor of itself, and it reveals a troubling trend. So Nepal exported about $11 million to China in 2022 worth of goods and imported about $1.8 billion in return. But more interestingly, over the past 5 years, the exports of Nepal to China have decreased at an annualized rate of 16%. And China's exports to Nepal have grown at a rate of 8.5%. So this suggests a very one-sided economic relationship. And even if you take a cursory look at the products that are traded between these two countries, it shows you how these trade relations are skewed in China's favor. China mainly exports communication equipment, computers, and industrial goods. And in return, Nepal exports a lot of textiles, agro products, and natural resources. But if you notice, or if you take a look at the last 4 or 5 years, China's exports are expanding into sectors that Nepal has traditionally been exporting to China. So China is now exporting the same goods at more competitive rates, and it's eroding any export capacity that Nepal might have with respect to China. And this is essentially what will slide into a situation of complete trade dependency. And this has already happened with Pakistan, where the asymmetry of economic engagement is most evident among all South Asian countries. And another form of commercial instrument that China deploys is trade facilitation infrastructure. And this is mainly to serve this mainly serves the purpose of indebting South Asian countries and sort of extracting concessions on the basis of them. In Pakistan, this China-Pakistan economic corridor has turned into a massive drag on Pakistan's economy, and like Frank referred to earlier. And the fact that China has refused to fund fresh projects due to the lack of progress on existing CPEC projects, that itself is revealing of how projects like the Gwadar port have become unappetizing investments mainly due to their unprofitability. And this is happening in other Himalayan countries as well. Take the Trans-Himalayan Multidimensional Connectivity Network, there's a mouthful, which is part of the BRI. And it's similar to CPEC, but it's between Nepal and China. And the entire project amounts to about 10% of Nepal's entire GDP. It's a very straightforward tactic to ensnare Nepal in debt and establish a lot of leverage. So besides these economic dimensions to China's strategy, there are a lot of political engagements with elites and civil society that China undertakes to sort of undermine the regional order and manipulate public opinion and change the status quo. China cultivates a lot of political capital by engaging agents across the spectrum, which is clearly visible in Pakistan and Nepal. For instance, in June, the China-Pakistan political parties' joint consultative mechanism met to discuss the CPEC, and during the meeting, all the parties expressed full support for the project. And one political party in Pakistan was even banned for criticizing the BRI in 2020. So this is how public discourse and political dialogue is sort of is distorted and poisoned. In Nepal, you have China engaging the communist parties to enable them to form a coalition government even. And in 2018, it facilitated a merger of both communist parties, both factions of the Communist Party, but that was a decision that was later overruled. That was later overruled by the Supreme Court. And these political ties are part of Beijing's strategy to cultivate a lot of political capital among elites in the Himalayan region and ensure that support and perceptions of China remain entirely favorable. And China engages with elites of all kinds, including those in the media and in the intellectual circles. They do this by funding a lot of trips to China, setting up friendship associations, organizing BRI conferences, conducting public diplomacy campaigns, and so on. And it's a comprehensive engagement strategy with elites of countries in the Himalayan region. And it's greatly influenced public opinion and official positions in favor of China. And this slowly sort of alters the balance of power and the stability of existing relationships. Finally, China's military posture is a clear attempt to use force to change status quo, and the pattern is consistent across China's border management approach, and elsewhere, and not just in India, Nepal, and Bhutan, but elsewhere as well, like Professor Wang and Astha have mentioned. In Nepal, China has trespassed in the Hamla district, and according to Nepal government documents, China has encroached on 36 hectares of Nepal's land at 10 different places on the northern border. In Bhutan, the government has accused China of unilaterally attempting to change the status quo again by building roads. This was happened in 2017. More recently, it's happened in 2023 in Kempajong. And these are very briefly some of the ways in which China has gone about altering the status quo in an effort to become a dominant hegemonic force. But I'll highlight two significant trends in the region that I think are relevant for the future. The first is multi-alignment. Nepal, Pakistan, Bhutan, smaller countries in the region are increasingly pursuing multi-alignment to hedge their bets. And it's become a source of strength for these countries, but it also has its drawbacks. As smaller countries, they are keener to leverage their positions in the interest to maximize the benefit they can get from larger regional players. And China's neighborhood strategy has identified this, and it's positioned well to sort of attract countries into China's orbit by offering them what is perceived to be the best deal. The second trend is water and transboundary rivers, which are going to be extremely significant for the immediate future. All the main river systems of South Asia originate in Tibet, and China's control of Tibet is along with the fact that they are increasingly willing to dam these rivers, which is a highly worrying trend for a water-stressed region like South Asia. And countries in the Himalayan region are locked into a cycle of water insecurity that involves dam building to secure a precious resource. And China is again aware of this strategy and is willing to leverage its hydro hegemony, and it will have a greater impact as the decades go by and as water becomes more of a security issue. I'll conclude my remarks here, and I can share the links to some of the publications I've mentioned earlier in the chat in case someone in the audience is interested. I'll stop here for now, and I'll hand back over to Dr. Panda. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahul. Again, very useful comments, and I think your point about how the trade contacts are one-sided, and I think that is one issue that smaller countries in the region should take a strong note of. And then you mentioned about the comprehensive engagement strategy of China, which is a matter of concern, because on the one hand, they are trying to grab lands and follow a kind of implement a kind of economic coercion strategy. On the other hand, there is a kind of a charm offensive strategy trying to align with the smaller countries, trying to woo them to their networks and try to take advantage of the regions. And your point about multi-alignment of the smaller countries in the regions is also very useful in the context of our project, because this is what I think the Himalayan regions on a whole should take a note of, that how countries should also try to navigate with the China challenge by coaching and strengthening their relationship with India and other countries in the regions. With this note, let me also invite some of you to have a further follow-up discussion about what specifically probably a country like India, which most of you actually rightly mentioned that India is the only challenger in the regions, particularly Professor Wang, who brought out that how rising India space in the Himalayan region is becoming a severe challenge to the rise of China. So keeping that aspect particularly in mind, what India and the West, India, US, India, the Western alliances, particularly India, Japan, India and Europe, could actually collaborate pertaining to the Himalayan regions? Is there a scope to collaborate? Of course, when it comes to the boundary dispute, and I think officially, both China and India would like not any external actors to interfere there. But there are a number of other issues in the Himalayan regions, for particularly the ecology, the environmental issues, the water issues, the glacier issues, then the connectivity and the corridor issues, which concerns not only the smaller countries in the Himalayan regions, but also many external actors, because India does follow in its foreign policy that narratives which welcomes the Western countries to come to the region and to invest and take advantage of India's welcoming note in the region, and take advantage of India's foreign policy planning there, particularly the way India is trying to develop corridors and connectivity in the region. So I will start with Professor Wang, since you pointed out about rise of India. how do you see really, where do you see the scopes of India and US working together? And do you think is it feasible? Do you think, given the kind of issues India has with China, do you think it is practically feasible that India and US could collaborate? If yes, in what manner, and what are the issues and sectors where India and US could possibly collaborate?
Sure. This discussion reminds me of a debate. This is more than 2,000 years ago in Chinese history, about the rise of the Qin as one of the 7 states of the warrior states period. Qin has become so dominant, so all the other smaller states face the dilemma whether they should band together and to balance Qin, or each one should seek accommodation with Qin. So the former strategy worked for a period of time, and the later strategy resulted in the destruction of each one of them. So China formed its first unified dynasty in 221 BC. Why do I mention this? China's obviously is a dominant power here, and in the South Asian context, it is butting head with India, because this region traditionally is India's strategic space. And China fully understands that in order to become dominant, it must displace India in this area. Just like that China would say that the Pacific Ocean is large enough, it should be able to accommodate 2 great powers. It means that it is trying to gradually supplant and expel the US. So what can the US and other countries do? I think that the notion about India as a partner has improved a great deal. This is a point probably Frank can further amplify. Over the last 20 years, I think gone are the days when India was allied with the Soviet Union and or otherwise practiced a quote-unquote independent foreign policy. But I think still India is very hesitant about increased alignment with the United States. But let's also remember that just like in the South China Sea context, the Himalayan case, the US would be an offshore balancing power. So this will be like a Great Britain playing the power of continental Europe, balance of power. So India must play a leading role in allying with all those small countries in South Asia, but at the same time convince the US, or at least let the US see the common interest of playing the role of offshore balancer. And I think there are a few things that they can do. One is that, for instance, China has been very active in using economic means such as infrastructure, trade, and so on, connectivity, to increase its relationship with these smaller South Asian countries. I think the US could consider maybe using a strategic rationale to open a discussion about free trade agreement with some of these countries. It might be surprising to many of us that the US had only free trade agreements with 20 or so states, and some of them are not on economic ground. For example, I cannot imagine that the US has a very strong economic rationale for FTA with Jordan or for Israel. But I think for a country, a rising economic power such as India, that if India and China and the United States have a FTA, I think that will symbolize a enhanced relationship beyond the purely strategic aspect. But it is more difficult at this moment. And I think that just to pick up the point about Astap mentioned earlier, that the other countries should also learn from other regions such as South China Sea and so on, and really realize that their best approach with China is actually multilateralism, not bilateralism. This is why China prefers to deal with each and every Southeast Asian country bilaterally, because in every bilateral context, China is much more powerful and it can exert leverage and all that. So although there are strategic aspects, I think as you mentioned earlier, Jagannath, at the beginning, that the Himalayas is actually a global commons. There are international treaties regulating, for example, the obligations of upstream states. In this case, China would be the upstream state because all the great rivers originating in the Tibetan plateau, they cannot simply just dam the water and cause cycles of drought and flood in the downstream state. So that discussion must be multilateral, and China cannot pick each other country apart. So these are just some of my initial thoughts about the possible areas of cooperation.
So thank you. I think those are interesting points, and I think your point about how China prefers bilateralism is well taken. Frank, coming to you, I think would you like to share more thoughts about what practically could be done between India and US, given the fact that there is a combo threat attached to India in the Himalayan regions, that is from China and Pakistan. And if we take into account what Srini was pointing out about the scenario in the Northeast Asia, then there is a North Korean dimension attached to it. Of course, North Korea is not a threat to India, at least in the Himalayan regions directly, but given their past behavior, as you have written on nuclear issues, their strong nuclear connect with Pakistan, all of these issues are very complicated issues. Do you think, keeping all of these complications in view, do you think practically it is possible for India and US to collaborate and check China's some of the hegemonic strategy? And if yes, in what ways we could do and what could be done practically in the regions, particularly when it comes to protecting the Himalayan regions, the commons, particularly the glacier environment, the water issues? Can there be a real ground level strategic understanding evolving between India and US in the Himalayan regions? Over to you, Frank.
Thank you, Jagannath. Yeah, excellent question. And so I think I'll split this into security first, and then military and economic ways that the US and India can cooperate toward those ends. Speaking bluntly, in the security field, with security in its broadest meaning, I think there does need to be candid discussions between Delhi and Washington about ultimately the kind of end state each would like to see for the Himalayan region, as well as more widely South Asia, and the kind of complementary roles each capital can play toward that end. And I'm slightly building off what Vincent was saying about sensitivities that India's had in the past, but Washington's role in the region, and perhaps Washington playing an offshore balancing role. And I also understand, separately, there's been frustrations from Delhi in the past when the US is seen to be providing military equipment to non-Pakistan states in South Asia without prior consultation with India. But I think there needs to be this kind of candid diplomatic discussion between the two capitals. And I think a larger perspective of enabling the South Asian states, these Himalayan states, to stand on their own feet and protect their independence as sovereign states, while still delivering for their citizens, can and should be at least that minimum shared security vision Washington and Delhi can adopt. And then the military and economic cooperation pieces come downstream of this. And I'll also talk about, extra-regional issues, toward the end. So in the military field, I think there, again, first needs to be kind of clarity around the kind of net security provider that India wants to be. There's concerns in the US around the persistently low Indian defense budgets, despite the Chinese challenges to India itself that I spoke about at the top of the discussion. And so, the Indian armies had to effectively weaken its posture against Pakistan in order to meet the growing Chinese threat, retasking the existing one strike corps from Pakistan-centric to Chinese-centric missions. Added on to this is the Atmanar Bharat defense technology indigenization thrust, and just its likelihood of being able to field the defense technology that India needs yesterday. When US offers like MQ-9B drones and GE F414 engines remain on the table. And so kind of clarifying, what India is looking for will help, in turn, help shape the scope of US military assistance to these Himalayan states. So, for example, there could be greater scope for U.S. foreign military financing, technology deals with these Himalayan states, but clarity on India's own position and perhaps ability to provide these technologies instead of the U.S. Can ensure the support is most effective. While these big questions are resolved, I think in the meantime, there is scope for things like joint U.S.-India training on mountain warfare and border protection with Himalayan states. That would be a useful measure, and perhaps potentially scaling this up to include these states in the annual Yud Abhyas, which Asta referred to earlier, U.S.-India Army exercise. There does need to be closer U.S.-India geoeconomic cooperation to provide that effective counter to Chinese economic penetration. And this could be run through the Quad if necessary for Indian political reasons, which would also help in linking together the growing Japanese and Australian interests in improving economic ties and investment in South Asia and the Himalayan region. I think just touching at the end on the interesting North Korea piece, this is again something that is, being, I think, looked at in DC in terms of this broader, perhaps recalibration, resetting of expectations from the India relationship. We've seen a bit of a learning curve in the US in terms of working with a state like India in the last couple of years. And so you saw, for example, this huge surprise in Washington, and in particular in the US Congress, about the initial Indian diplomatic positions toward the Russia-Ukraine war. And this really stems from the fact that, the Congress in particular just doesn't have a lot of experience dealing and working with a partner which deviates from US preferences further than, France under de Gaulle. And so as part of that, I think there's been a learning in the US since then, but at the same time, I think there's been a resetting of expectations. So I think there's been a quiet US move away from expecting significant Indian military support in a Taiwan contingency. And I think, when you get to the larger, North Korean questions and the future of the Korean Peninsula, I'm not sure if we can expect that India would be kind of a leading player in resolving that beyond perhaps diplomatic support. So I hope that there is scope there for expanded cooperation, but there needs, I think, to be kind of a fairly candid exchange of perspectives on those end states for the Himalayan region as ideally the best starting point, as well as arguably the most urgent for India, and then building forward from there so the two capitals can decide how they can work together most effectively. Thanks.
I think your comments are very relevant, Frank, and I think I do agree with you that there has to be a closer understanding between India and US, particularly keeping the geopolitical environment in mind. And there is a scope to talk about greater collaboration, not only within the Quad, but outside the Quad ambit, and also keeping the Taiwan contingency in perspective. But this also encouraged me to draw Srini's attention, again, trying to link it with the big pictures. How do you think, Srini, given the fact that between India and US, there are 4 foundational agreements that are there, particularly on the security and defense issues. Now, keeping all of those 4 foundational agreements in view, do you think is it sufficient that India and US could collaborate within those agreements in the Himalayan regions and outside the Himalayan regions, or something specific we need in order to discuss about the issues, about the challenges, about the threats in the Himalayan regions? And if yes, what are those possible agreements we should be talking about, and what are the issues we should be really talking to cover in those agreements? Second, how do you really see the emerging security concerns that is arising in the regions, particularly after the Ukraine war, the kind of authoritarian build-up which is happening, China, Pakistan, with a close networks emerging between China, Russia, and Russia, North Korea. So these are authoritarian build-ups which are emerging. So if we take into consideration this big picture, how do you see that between India and US, already these 4 foundational agreements are sufficient enough? We have a 2+2 dialogue format. Is it really sufficient enough to address the Himalayan issues, or we need something else which is missing between India and US? How do you really suggest and recommend some of these issues in your thoughts?
Great questions and great summary there. And Frank already has alluded to a lot of issues. So let me kind of get into some of them. The frustrations, I feel the historical frustrations that India and the United States has experienced is resurfacing in a quite, I say, urgent manner. And you see the frustrations largely happening because there is an excessive amount of focus or a naturally excessive amount of focus, I should say, in India's domestic issues. That is the one that is getting a lot of coverage in Washington. And that is also driving a lot of wedges in the mutual relationship. So, and I think the way India is also reacting in its public posture has been a little bit, I should say, sharp diplomacy, as the External Affairs Minister himself has described it. And the sharpness has only gotten, more edgier, I should say, in the past few 6 months, as the elections in India were conducted, the elections of Ms. Hasina, and where India was aligned on it. And we will have to see what the narrative that is coming out as we speak about the changes in Bangladesh, and also about India's treatments of its own population in certain areas. And that has driven a lot of issues in there and almost overtaken the dialogue. And I think I agree with Frank that needs to be more honest, one-on-one bilateral sort of issues that are happening, maybe off the books, so that they can have an honest conversation without having external issues impinge on them. Easier said than done. I don't think there's any particular appetite for or in both countries for that. Both countries are charting their own path in regarding security and domestic issues. Also, the United States, as you know, has a big election coming, and that is going to determine a lot of how the policy shapes going forward in there. And on the defense issue, on the foreign military sales particularly, this has been in the media for a long time. And India has been buying Russian oil. That has been a source of issue. India has been buying Iranian oil, but although its footprint has reduced significantly on that particular issue. The Indian Prime Minister, relations with Moscow has been a particularly sore issue in there. And the fact that India has been asked to do a more public posture on Ukraine, and it has been historically unwilling to give up on its special status of relationship with Moscow. And that also has a bearing on the defense procurement and defense acquisition strategy, which, as you know, Jagannath, is been very slow. It is mired in domestic politics. The Indian bureaucracy notoriously moves slow, and everything has to be done in triplicate at the minimum, multiple forms to be filed, and India has not shown, excepting some big set piece purchases, as same sense of urgency in defense procurement. Could be a budget issue, could be a domestic politic issue, and it as the Atmanirbhar policies, or the self development. It's been there. I mean, I know this. This has been around for a long time. It has been trying to produce a light combat aircraft, its own tanks, machine guns, you name it, right? But the production capacity scaled enough to meet the urgency of the situation. So there is that challenge in there. Even the United States is grappling with a significant issue with the defense industrial production base. A lot of the chipsets are made in Taiwan, and the ammos are being produced in different parts of the world, and they're not able to be fired by every 155 gun. So there's a lot of issues that the U.S. itself is facing, and I think India has not shown, at least in a public urgency, on that matter in there, and it is trying to sort of steer the conversation or dampen the urgency of the issue that is happening in the Himalayas, and that has been a concern. But I think that the way to find forward is to find a mutual ground where it can play a role, not only as a stabilizer in the region, as it is historically done, with a lot of political transitions happening in the smaller South Asian countries, and also as leaning and in such a way, it is telegraphing to China that India is defensively prepared with the external support to be able to counter the challenges on the northern front. So I'll leave that there at this point. Thank you again. Great set of questions.
No. Again, I think these are useful comments, and I think I do agree with you and Frank that we need more honest and one-on-one conversation between India and US. This is a respected partnership in Indo-Pacific. We cannot really allow it to get disturbed. But I think the Himalayan region issues are critical issues. We need honest and bilateral discussion and probably pointed discussion. And I think that will be more useful in the context of India and US. Before I come to Rahul and then to Astha, I would encourage all of our participants, if they have any questions, they could type it in the Q&A box so that some of the panelist members could address some of these questions. But while saying that, I'll come back to Rahul, to you. There is a comment and kind of a questions from one of our participants about Nepal. As you have covered about China and Nepal, how do you really see that, what India could possibly do with Nepal in order to convince Nepal that here is one country which is actually creating debt traps in the regions, particularly if we take into consideration the case of Sri Lanka, or for that context, a few other countries from outside the regions. Nepal should actually have a realistic review about China's Belt and Road initiatives. So how do you really see what India could possibly do, and what countries like Nepal should be mindful about China's Belt and Road initiatives, particularly about the railway project they are currently building? What is your thought? What would you recommend in terms of to our Nepalese friend to think and consider or review some of the Chinese projects which are coming with a lot of charm, strategy of trying to woo them, but eventually trying to trap them in the longer run? So what is your take on some of these issues?
Thank you. Thanks again, Dr. Panda. Excellent points from my co-panelists. So the realization that Beijing's inroads into South Asia have a destabilizing effect have always been present in India, and I think this thinking has become more prevalent over the last few years. But India's unilateral actions have been rather agile and effective over the last few years. Just with respect to the question in the chat with respect to Nepal, I think the first thing to do would be, counter the narrative that China has, that it offers the most reliable development partnerships to countries in the global south. And India has vocalized that it has a differentiated development outreach. And it contrasts this to the kind of development model that China offers. And it does so by emphasizing that debt from China, unlike debt from China, its own development partnership focuses on the sustainability of debt, also on the transparency in the processes related to disbursement of finance and project development. India has sort of brought these concerns to the forefront and flagged them as serious issues associated with China's development partnership narrative. And so India has indicated how its own development outreach, on the other hand, is rooted in democratic principles, and it involves consultations with local stakeholders. It is in adherence to local laws and norms while delivering on promises at the same time. So the BRI and China's development narrative, it had no answer for some time now. And India has been partially successful in presenting a more clear-eyed, balanced, realistic picture of the BRI to countries in South Asia. And it's already working if you at least with respect to Nepal, because Nepal has a BRI implementation program. It's not been signed in about 6-7 years. There is not a single BRI project in Nepal. And the railway that is often discussed, the railway line is a highly unfeasible project. The feasibility study has been, they've just commissioned, some funding has been released for the feasibility study itself. But again, the project itself is not, there's no absorption capacity for it. If you talk to some of the officials in Nepal, they will tell you the same thing. And there's a lot of these unviable projects that China has presented. And over time, getting familiar with dealing with China, I think Nepal and some of the smaller South Asian countries have realized that, and they've become a little more wary about dealing with China, especially when it comes to large, big ticket infrastructure that China offers. There's another way in which India has sort of been countering China in the Himalayan region, and that is with respect to infrastructure build-up along the Himalayan region and within India itself. And this is to sort of check Beijing's military aggression in disputed areas. So projects like the Arunachal Frontier Highway and the Sela Tunnel and several other highway projects and tunnel and bridge projects, they're all signaling India's will to stand up to salami slicing tactics along the Himalayan region. The Border Villages program is also part of that same effort. The point is to establish this border infrastructure as a major signal that it will to China, that China will have to incur greater costs if it wants to alter the status quo by force. And there's a few more ways that I would say that I would recommend countering China's approach, or at least solutions that have a higher chance of working. One is expanded development outreach. India should look to offer development solutions that are sustainable, they're driven by local demand, and they're developed in partnership with trusted actors. And a great example of this is third country cooperation that India and Japan are engaged in the northeast of India and in Bangladesh via JICA. And I think these kind of arrangements sort of bring trade facilitation infrastructure into South Asia, and these kind of arrangements need to be accelerated and institutionalized. I think another effective way of countering China would be to leverage soft power. And India has significant cultural and social linkages with Himalayan countries in Nepal and Bhutan. And these linkages are not, China doesn't share the same linkages. And what linkages it does share, it shares via Tibet. And those are being eroded slowly by China's heavy hand in the province. So India's soft power has great reach and potential to shape public perceptions. The public opinion survey in Nepal, I mean, there's a lot of revealing, there's a lot of things that it does reveal. More than 65% of the respondents that I spoke to, they've described India as more relatable and as a friend. And perceptions of China are more transactional. So this largely has to do with cultural and familial ties that countries like Bhutan and Nepal share with India. And leveraging those, I think, offers a lot of options. And finally, I think India should shoulder the effort to build more global partnerships via institutions, which are sort of gateways for international engagement in South Asia. So BIMSTEC, the Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation. In this regard, it's recently acquired legal personality, meaning it can involve new members in its engagements. And this can sort of match what China is offering. There's the motor vehicles agreement and the coastal shipping agreement. These are all regional integration initiatives. So they sort of bring these South Asian countries in a sort of regional framework. And there is also the opportunity to engage via minilaterals like the BBI and Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal, and India, that cooperation process. So under these broader institutional arrangements, you have smaller cooperation frameworks that can work. And so these arrangements sort of, when they deliver on the promises and they align with the value systems of South Asian countries, they can counter China's efforts to establish a Himalayan Quad. I think I'll stop here and hand it back over to you, Dr. Panda.
Thank you, Rahul. I think again, very, very relevant comments, and I think I do agree with you about the third country cooperation, about outreach development, and also about the counter narrative that we need to build. But one interesting point you mentioned is about Japan, and this interests me to bring Asta into the discussion. Asta, how do you really see Japan could be a more greater or a greater partner of India in the regions, particularly given the fact that Japan is already a largest investor in the northeastern part of India? Can Japan take the risk of investing in the core Himalayan regions, let's say in the Western Ladakh or in the Ladakh region? How India can really convince Japan? Whether Japan will take that risk, because Japan is still in having a good relations with Pakistan. Japan is still having a good relations with many other countries, including China, which is one of the key critical economic partner of Japan. So can Japan take that risk with India? And if yes, what are the further sectors and what are the further initiatives that India and Japan should take in the regions in order to strengthen the partnership? And how is it really going to benefit Japan? Would you please throw some lights on this?
Yeah, thank you. I'll try and build up on where Rahul basically left on that note. And what I'd like to highlight first, I'll tackle your question in two parts. And one is trying to understand myself while I highlight the issue as to why Japan is the preferred partner for India, really, when it comes to the Himalayan region or such a sensitive geography. And then I'll come to what they are doing and what they're not doing effectively. So why Japan? I mean, one of the biggest reasons is that Japan does understand the fact that India wants a very specific sort of issue-based engagement with a third partner, especially in sensitive regions such as the Northeast region. And so Japan is willing to put in the money there on Indian terms. So which means that, it's not going to impose any other conditions on India and then aid India in the way India needs it. So the second important thing is Japan also understands what an antagonistic nuclear pair could look like. So Japan is already dealing with China and North Korea. So it does know what a security issue could look like. And when it looks at India's position versus China and Pakistan, let's say alliance sort of or partnership, it does understand India's vulnerabilities in that aspect, right? Third, Japan has this understanding of the implications of how China, and this was kind of highlighted by one of the previous panelists as well, how China is trying to slowly take a small nibble at the cookie till it really eats it all up. So there is that understanding, which is why Japan, as of recently, especially in 2022, the Diet basically started recognizing issues of Tibet or sensitive issues of Hong Kong as pertinent to human rights violation and challenge to the status quo. So that was new coming from Japan. Then Japan understands that it needs to provide an alternative in a way. It doesn't want to pose as one, but it does know that it can provide an alternative to Chinese model of development. And in general, Japan has a very good track record, whether it's in Southeast Asia or South Asia, particularly. So there is no issue of debt financing. There is lesser issue of quality. So all the projects are really running well, the ones that Japan has been engaged in. And then there is no sort of direct political implications for it either, unlike the ones that we see with China, right? And then lastly, and why India got very interested is that Japan has, and this was by current Prime Minister Kishida in Japan, when he was the finance minister back in 2015, he went all out declaring that we recognize Arunachal Pradesh as a territory of India. And that kind of angered China because it came across as very confrontational. But Japan held on to its position, so did the US. Before that. So that felt to India like, that this is one partner we can rely on. So there is this issue of understanding with the US, but then not so much with Japan. So Japan seems to be like the right choice there, right? And then, of course, Japan has more experience when it comes to disaster risk management and in fragile economies and environmental issues. And so there is that knowledge that can be exchanged on that aspect. Now, what has Japan done? Basically, Japan, apart from establishing this bilateral relationship and India elevating it to a global strategic partnership and establishing a 2+2 dialogue mechanism, Japan under Kishida came up with this new Indo-Pacific strategy wherein connectivity is a key pillar, and Japan highlighted both India as the key partner of choice within the Indian Ocean region, and two, northeast region of India and strategic islands around India as points wherein Japan is willing to invest. So when I'm talking about strategic islands, I'm talking about Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which are very close to the Malacca Straits, right? Then there is a confluence and very direct sort of relationship between Japan's idea of expanded partnership for quality infrastructure, which it clearly juxtaposes against Chinese infrastructure projects, alongside India's Act East policy. And what must be noticed here is that when Doklam happened in June 2017, very quickly in September 2017, India and Japan established an Act East forum, which was very much focused on Northeast Indian region and the development therein, right? So, and there were two main objectives to that. One was to promote some sort of a connectivity and development and economic development and promote livelihood of the people that are living there alongside environmental conservation in India's very less developed Northeast, but also to connect that Northeast to not just Bay of Bengal, but also to the wider ASEAN region. So that sort of a connectivity provided Japan with an opportunity to step in as the only partner that at that point India was willing to have in that sensitive region, as a trusted partner that could also help India with its diplomacy, with the Japanese money, to go and enter into partnerships with these countries and sort of create this bilateralism, or bilateralism with each country agreeing to the project, and then overall picture appears more minilateral or multilateral, right? Then JICA, and I think Rahul was alluding to it earlier, that JICA, and this is really important because JICA in its policy, which is like helping Japan with these projects, mentioned that it wants to reduce disparities. And the words that they use are, we want to support Northeast, coastal areas, island, and North Himalayas. That was the first time Japan actually in its any policy highlighted that it really wants to support North Himalayas. And that was very pointed because this is a recent document by Japan. So when we look at India's Northeast region, of course, the projects go from building dams to roads to helping people with the medical facilities, water supply, sewage, right? And then there's people-to-people exchanges. But there is also a big aspect of responsible debt financing practices, right? And that is where Japan tries to pitch in projects wherein it can bring, on one hand, BBIN countries, which is Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, and then connect them to both Bay of Bengal on one hand, and also to ASEAN nations by building ports and other facilities within the ASEAN nations, right? And then to expand it a little bit, Japan and India also launched an AAGC, which is Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. And although I am not very satisfied with the way the development of that project is going, because it continues to slow down, and during COVID it just slowed down and then again picking up and down a little bit. But it was good as an indicator of an alternative partnership that could exist by two such partnering countries that don't appear antagonistic or in any way want to encroach on any other country's territories, right? So that was that. Apart from that, of course, India and Japan strengthened their partnerships with the acquisition and cross-servicing agreement, the Malabar exercises and bilateral exercises, joint naval exercises. So they are addressing both India's needs. They are trying to address India's Northeast region needs. Japan is simultaneously also trying to not provoke China, but at the same time trying to invest in more projects in Bhutan, in Nepal, which don't appear outright confrontational or too close to the Chinese territory with India, too close to the LAC. At the same time, there are implications because it is helping in some way India to build those road connectivity projects and make sure that India does have access, and so do these small countries, right? And lastly, to mention about both India and Japanese partnership, they are running some successful projects such as the Matabari port in Bangladesh. Now, given the current situation in Bangladesh, it is yet to be seen what's going to happen eventually. But as of now, that project stands and it's been working, and there is an understanding between the three nations there, Japan, India, and Bangladesh, that this is important to their connectivity. So, and within the Himalayan region, Japan has already identified 11 corridors which are clearly road projects and highway projects, which connect both, like I mentioned, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Nepal. So it's going from bilateral to trilateral to multilateral very quickly, given Japanese diplomacy and Indian partnership there. And lastly, India and Japan launched their official partnership, and to celebrate this global strategic partnership, they have officially named a new policy, which is called Connecting Himalayas and Mount Fuji. Although they try and pose that policy as being more of a policy of cultural understanding, but then there are these security undertones to it. There is this economic sort of connectivity to it. And of course, this kind of shows us how Japan and India together are beginning to understand why Japan needs to kind of push itself a little bit more deeper into where India's vulnerabilities are and help India there. And at the same time, help India also establish itself as an alternative player within the wider Indo-Pacific region. Where they lack, and I think that's very, very pertinent, because one example that comes to my mind is the Jakarta-Bandung railway project, which China won vis-a-vis Japan. And what we need to understand is that Japanese strategies for quality infrastructure have impacted China and how China is revamping its BRI projects, right? So it's trying to talk about small but beautiful projects which don't have too much of a financial implication. At the same time, there are lessons to be learned, and this is a learning that all countries together need to view. This is not just a case of Sri Lanka. This is a fairly recent case wherein a certain amount of money was promised, and Indonesian government shouldn't have had to take that much of a financial burden, but they took both the financial burden and the delay, right? So countries are noticing. I think the region in general is understanding what is happening there, right? They are weighing in the pros and cons of picking Japan or India or China as their preferred partner. But on the other hand, we must understand two things. One, a lot of times these projects and who wins these projects has to do with domestic politics and how China's checkbook diplomacy sometimes wins. And second thing, there is still a hesitance in both India and Japan in that aspect. So Japan still wants to be, or would prefer to be, seen as a pacifist nation, peace-loving nation that is really not going out front against China. Similarly, India wants to appear clearly non-confrontational to China. So even though there are avenues wherein, like I mentioned, all these projects which have just started, and they can really expand them to include more partners, but we need to weigh in the fact that they're constantly trying to balance with China and trying to make sure that China doesn't perceive them as completely antagonistic. Thank you.
Excellent comments, Astan. I think I do agree with you. The quality infrastructure issue has been one of those issues that has pushed the Chinese into corner. But I think your comments about Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, which is not really moving forward, that could be re-looked between India and Japan, whether we could revive it in some forms. And also trying to connect most of these issues from the ASEAN regions, from the Bay of Bengal regions to the Himalayan regions will be interesting to move forward India-Japan collaboration in the regions. There are two specific comments, rather questions in the chat box, in the Q&A box. So I will pose these two questions to Frank and Rahul, because I know for a fact that they have written and covered some of these issues. There is a question that there was a mention about China building and eventually exploring one-sided trade relationship. Can the panelists highlight areas where trade complementarities could be built between India and China? So that is one. Maybe both Rahul and Frank could address it. And then the other one is, how can India manage anti-India sentiments in Nepal, especially with the Nepali elites, elite communities in Nepal? Maybe if Srini or Professor Wang and Asta would like to pitch in and comment on some of these issues, that would be interesting. And then we'll go for a quick roundup for the final session. So I'll start with you, Frank.
Thank you. Excellent question on trade complementarity. It's very difficult. At the moment, going back to what was previously said about there being a bit of a thaw between the MEA and MOFA, we're seeing in India a recognition that it simply hasn't got enough of an economic base distinct from requiring Chinese components for electronics and things like that. So we have seen, for example, Indian businesses calling for some of the post 2020 restrictions on Chinese trade to be lifted. I don't think this necessarily helps India long term. And I think that ideally, the kind of complementary trade would be that where a developed India was able to essentially do what China is doing now and sell sophisticated, high-end technologies at low cost price into China to be more competitive against Chinese products. But right now it is difficult to see kind of a trade complementary relationship between India and China, given we know how much China does weaponize the trade that it does have. So that's a fairly, grim answer. Perhaps Rahul has something brighter to say.
Sure. Rahul?
Not really, Frank. I think I echo what you just said. It does look very grim at the moment. The idea of India and China having trade complementarities, it doesn't seem realistic anymore, especially now that we know the way China weaponizes supply chains and leverages its dominance, especially with respect to renewables, lithium, all kinds of critical technologies and materials. I think the appetite for exploring or even discussing trade complementarities with China is very limited in India at the moment. But recently there have been a few signals about allowing Chinese FDI back into India. It's a bit of a roundabout way of dealing with the problem because the trade deficit is a sensitive issue. So if you're able to reduce the trade deficit by allowing the factory to be established right in India, then you are sort of reducing the deficit starts to go down in a certain way. I think that is the thinking at the moment. So that's why that's why there is a bit of a conversation going on about allowing Chinese FDI into India at the moment. But that's a very it's mainly focused on a very like short-term political gain, which is to reduce the trade deficit, but not actually alleviate the deep dependencies on China in terms of reliance on all kinds of industrial goods. And if you just look at the import-export profiles of both countries, which is something we do at Orca, we have a trade dashboard that looks at all trade between the two countries, from the most generic level down to the most specific level. Every single product, and you can tell that there is an asymmetry in the relationship. There are deep dependencies that China will exploit and can exploit. So trade complementarities do not look even a conversation about that doesn't appear to be on the horizon.
No, great points. I do agree with you, Rahul. But would you like to comment also on the Nepal issue? How we could overcome about anti-India sentiments in Nepal's elites? Any comments from you or any of the panelists could comment?
Sure. Yeah, I'll take a crack at that question. With respect to anti-India sentiments, there are opportunities that present themselves to India when certain events and developments happen in Nepal, and India has to sort of take advantage of those events, and that's a great way of mending fences with Nepal and sort of building up that positive public opinion back up again. The whole reason why there's a lot of anti-India sentiment in Nepal is because mainly of the 2015 blockade, and there have been efforts to repair the India-Nepal relationship since then, but they've been it's an on and off thing. But in 2021, there was an earthquake in Nepal, and I felt like that was an opportunity to restore how India deals with the humanitarian crisis at its doorstep. So those are the kinds of opportunities that India needs to identify, and that's an avenue by which you fix public opinion. Apart from that, a lot of public diplomacy work that goes on in Nepal. There's a lot of investment in the education sector and a lot of opportunities like that India can explore to sort of repair public opinion. A lot of Nepali students look to come to India, so making their education in India easier, making it easier for them to access education and even the job market here in India, all of those things would cultivate and create a lot of favorable impressions among the younger generation of Nepalis, and that I think will sort of build positive impressions of India.
So those are excellent points, and I think somebody in Delhi must be listening it very carefully, and also in Kathmandu, people must be hearing it carefully. But with this note, if other panelists doesn't want to comment on some of these questions, then we can go for a final round. I would invite each one of you just to share your thoughts very briefly in 2 minutes, 2 points. What are the urgent issues in the regions that we should, or the Himalayan neighbors should take into account about China's revisionist strategy in the Himalayan regions? What are the two key points, the trends that are problematic that the countries like Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, including other countries like Sri Lanka, should take a note of it, and probably they should take a distance from accepting on its face value from the Chinese. Second, what India and the US, or India and Europe, or India and the other Indo-Pacific partners should possibly do together in order to resist or create a kind of a challenge to China in the Himalayan regions. So if you could share your thoughts very briefly in 2 minutes, in 1 minute each, these 2 points, that would be an excellent policy recommendation to our webinar. So I'll start probably first with Srini, then with Astha, then with Professor Wang, and then Rahul, and then finally we'll end as we started with Frank, so we'll end with Frank. Srini, over to you first.
So it sort of builds up on what Mr. Rahul pointed out previously. The 2015 blockade of Nepal is a sore point. So the problem with India's near neighborhood policy is that it has a long history, right? There's a long history of British colonial India, where all these countries surrounding India were once a part of it. And India sort of is the big tiger in the region, and these are smaller countries. There's a perception that, rightly and maybe wrongly, that it has mismanaged its relationship. Sri Lanka, it has a long history in there. It doesn't need to be revisited. But recently, I think they moved the button, I should say, or moved the chess piece a little bit post collapse of the Rajapaksa government. India's relationship with Ranil Wickremesinghe government has been modulated. If you take Maldives, when the current president of Moizu came into power, the relationship was really rough for first few months with the Twitter war and so on and so forth. It seems to have stabilized a bit. India's moved some of its a small contingent of HADR personnel from one of the outer islands, and the external affairs minister just met with the president of Maldives. It seems to have stabilized a bit. India-Nepal relationship is kind of need a little bit work. India and Bhutan relationship probably is the best out there. And India, Bangladesh, and India-Pakistan, those are the three big countries, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, in that order, and most populous too. And that's going to be friction, because the last 20 years, oddly, roughly, India's sided with the Hasina government, like it or not. They've sided with her, and that is going to produce enormous frictions with India, for the new government that is going to come in, whether it's the interim government of Dr. Yunus or the potential future BNP Jamaat government that will come into power. They are not going to be what Prime Minister Hasina was. And that's definitely a tough neighborhood policy. And this is also a problem for India, and which many of the people sitting outside, and I tell people around, and the people that I meet here, look, India's got so many problems in its neighborhood. It gets up in the morning, they got Pakistan, they got Nepal, they got Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Maldives just to deal with. and they don't even have time to look at Southeast Asia or the South Pacific Islands. It is so preoccupied with its own neighborhood, and that is both a benefit and a significant constraint that it is not able to punch out of the boxes that it is within. For example, I've been, calling for a more robust relation with Taiwan, but Indian government has been a little bit more resistant to it. Historically, because many people in the panel said they don't want to like poke the bear or poke the dragon in this case with the Taiwan relationship. There's a great opportunity for India to build its technology industry with Korea, and there's some relationship in automobiles, some relationship with cellular phones. But the Korean industrial capacity, especially in port building, shipbuilding, maritime capacity, now with submarines, this is pretty extraordinary. What Korea has achieved, and much along paralleling Japan in many ways. There's an opportunity there that needs to be tapped up. Even the India-Japan partnership in the area of trains has proceeded a little bit slowly than many people would like, but for all the reasons. So if there's one elevator pitch, let's be urgent about it. Let's seize the day and move the cart forward in a very rapid pace. That's what I would say. Thank you.
Thank you, Srini. Astha?
Yeah, thank you. I'll kind of I agree with Srini completely, and I'll pick it up from where he left. I think India really needs to rethink and revamp its neighborhood first policy, because even though India would like to prioritize its neighborhood, it needs to also ensure that the neighborhood says India first and not India out. So that's really important. There also has to be an understanding, which is basically the onus lies on India, as to what China is doing in the Himalayas, what China is doing in the Indian Ocean region, maintaining some sort of a dialogue mechanism, including all partners in that discussion, and ensuring that other mechanisms, okay, if SARC is an issue, we do have BIMSTEC, we do have BBIN, right? And nothing is stopping India from really recreating another such platform with third partners, fourth partners. So that is something which India really needs to proactively look at to promote this understanding of what China is doing and how it could actually impact the region as a whole and an individual nation. So on that front, India needs to do more. Third, there is a possibility, and a big possibility, of potentially partnering with EU as a whole or certain EU nations, because EU has a lot of understanding, technological advantage, scientific research advantage. For instance, in Himalayan region, the glacial melt, climate change, disaster practices, all these are things on which probably an India-EU partnership will not look confrontational to China, but just collaborative or developmental, right? So that's an opportunity. Similarly, with India and Korea, again, I think India is kind of missing out that opportunity, because Korea recently announced that in the next 10, 15 years, it's going to pull Nepal out of the least developed country status. Now, that is the kind of opportunity that India needs to seize and say, how about we partner with you and help Nepal do that and actually achieve that, maybe accelerate it, right? India hasn't done it yet, but it would be a welcome step. And similarly, the things with India-Japan relations, there's a lot they can do. Bureaucratic pressures, political issues, try to pull those initiatives down, but again, India needs to be more active on that front. And lastly, I think India needs to also start taking new initiatives in the region and not merely responding to China, because Indian foreign policy more or less still looks like it is always responding and is always on a back foot at all times. So in a bid to appear more peaceful, rising country, it is actually losing out on a lot on the diplomatic front. So I'll kind of sum it up where I began earlier by saying that India needs to do more on three fronts as a whole, in terms of preparedness, in terms of more partnerships, and in terms of more proactiveness.
Thank you. Excellent remarks again. Professor Wang?
Sure. My elevator speech, this is from someone who actually has a lot of admiration for India, is for India to begin behaving more like a establishment power rather than anti-establishment power. Now, our immediate topic today is China's hustle in Himalaya. And earlier I talked about, maybe the the conference thought about China and EU as sort of offshore balancer. So, but my question is, why do other people or other countries care about India's agenda? If India cannot, reciprocate or show more empathy and understanding, let me just give you one example. Earlier, I think some of my fellow panelists talked about India a lot of times still behave like an aggrieved former colonial power rather than an establishment power. I'm joining you from Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania. It's a small country with a population of 2.88 million, smaller than any Indian city, but they have the Ukrainian flags all over, even in front of their presidential palace. And look what India is doing. India is buying Russian oil, buying Iranian oil, and so on, and is very hesitant to join the condemnation against Russia. Just India is actually behaving like China. China is doing the same. So I think India needs to change. India needs to revamp its neighborhood policy. I think the Indian Foreign Service of 800 people, very elitist, but it's too small for a country of 1.4 billion people to work on a lot of issues. And if you don't care about issues that are important to others, why should other people be concerned about your issues? So that will be my elevator speech.
Excellent remarks, Professor Wong. Rahul?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Panda. I think excellent points by panelists. I think just a few policy angles for India to consider. India's investment in critical infrastructure in South Asia, they need to be accompanied by a lot of standard setting and regulatory integration to bring Himalayan countries and South Asia under a regional framework of standards and norms. I think this is the more China engages itself in offering infrastructure standards and regulatory norms, they sort of come along with that same offering. So this could be in the domain of cross-border electricity trade, digital public infrastructure, railways, and all kinds of development projects. And you need institutional vehicles to sort of achieve this if you're going to do it outside a bilateral setting. And BIMSTEC and these other regional frameworks need to be energetic and absolutely vitalized. Second, India's conduct of joint exercises in the Himalayas and other strategically important regions, I think they're necessary to improve interoperability and operational readiness. I think this is just waiting to be regularized and institutionalized. So the Yuddha Abhyas is obviously just one example. And finally, I think technical education and training programs to build up human capital in smaller countries in South Asia is absolutely vital, because these programs provide the smaller countries the autonomy that they need and want, and they provide them the self-reliance they seek, and they also eliminate the need for China to step in. So this is also has a bearing on positive public perception. So for example, in Nepal, there are no railway engineers to man certain cross-border railway lines, especially like the one connecting Bijalpur to Jayanagar. And so these kinds of training programs, technical education programs, they fill important gaps. And I think they should be a priority in any regional or international aid or development initiative that is targeted at South Asian countries. I think that's all from my side. Thank you.
Again, very, very useful comments, Rahul. Thank you. Frank, we'll end with you. Yeah.
Yeah, the great thing about coming last is all the good ideas are taken. So I don't really have anything to offer on the first question. On the second one, what can the US, EU, West do to help? I think it's a challenge, especially with the EU in particular, in terms of making the sell that it should be spending a lot of aid money elsewhere, given its demographics. As an aging population, it always wants money to be spent within the EU. I think framing it to the EU in terms of climate resilience, which I know is not the focus of this webinar, but that's something that might perhaps be a stronger argument for why there should be more developmental spending in the Himalayas to counter that of China. And from climate resilience, we can get into phrasing about human security and things like that. I think that's perhaps a valuable avenue and way of framing it to unlock that kind of development, to complement that of Japan and India. I also think and I'm sure that the states are already doing this, but it would be perhaps wise for the Himalayan states to work on developing their own independent relationship with Washington, because doing so, I think obviously helps get them more on Washington's radar for their own end, but it also should help ideally compel that kind of US-Indian conversation I spoke about earlier, because if they're speaking to Washington, that draws India's attention. I agree with what Asta and I think other panelists said, that India's diplomacy does tend to be fairly reactive, and with regard to its neighborhood, fairly intermittent. So it reacts to something happening in the neighborhood. And you can kind of use that tendency to perhaps compel that greater, hopefully permanent Indian interest in the region through partnering with Washington. Just my last point, this is kind of a side point, but with Vincent, I'm less concerned with India buying oil from Russia, because I think at least recently, Russia is pretty much losing money on this oil. It's creating a hole in its budget because India is one of the few buyers that can negotiate down the cost of Russian oil. And the second part is that if it doesn't get sold to India, then more of it would likely go to China, and even further deepen Russia's economic dependence, strategic dependence upon China. So for those kinds of strategic regions, I'm not really as concerned about India importing Russian oil on that side of it. I think that I'll stop there. Yeah. Thank you.
No, thank you, thank you, Frank. And I think you are spot on. I think it's been a very useful and enriching discussion today afternoon here. And I think we have really been beneficial in terms of understanding what India could possibly do, not only with the West, but on its own in the Himalayan regions. And also this webinar will help us to understand also how the smaller countries in the Himalayan region should behave, keeping in mind how the Chinese are changing the status quo in the regions. With this note, let me thank all of you for your useful time and comments, remarks today. We are going to prepare a report and put the report on the website. And also, there is a follow-up webinar tomorrow we are doing at the same time. Those who are interested, you could join. Also, we take this opportunity to thank all of our participants who have joined us from different parts of the globe. With this note, let me, on the behalf of our director, Dr. Nicholas Sundstrom, who unfortunately has left for another meeting, thank all of you for joining today and making this webinar an excellent forum of discussion. We'll stay in touch with you for our future events, for our future programs. But with this note, let me personally also thank all of you, and happy to meet you after a gap online. And we'll stay in touch and have a good evening, good night, wherever you are based in. Thank you very much.